welcome everyone to the 8th in the series of Bilateral Bites with the Australia-India Institute. Today we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Sanjay Sarin with us to discuss diagnostics. Dr. Sanjay Sarin is the head of the Foundation of Innovative New Diagnostics in India and also heads the Access Program for the Asia Pacific. He has a doctorate from PGIMR in Chandigarh and 20 years of experience in health policy and market development. In his current role, he's responsible for providing the leadership for strategic plan development, ensuring continued engagement with partners and donors at local and international levels, and leading the resource mobilization efforts in the Asia Pacific region. So Sanjay, thank you very much for joining us. It's a privilege to have you with us today.
Thanks, Tanya, for the very kind introductions. I'm particularly happy to be of value as far as this very important video podcast that you're doing.
Thank you. And indeed, it's quite important to be talking to you. As you know, ever since coronavirus started, they say in December, perhaps earlier, 2019, in order to have sensible evidence-based policy intervention to control the spread of disease, diagnostics are critical. There's been a lot of discussion about whether, testing has been done widely enough, and yet we don't really spend enough time talking to the experts in diagnostics. So first of all, for those who don't know, the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics holds the only WHO collaborating centre on diagnostics. And I believe you partner also with the World Health Organization, UNITAID and others to help to deliver diagnostics across the region. Could you please tell us a little bit about that role and also whether there are different kinds of tests for the coronavirus?
Okay, so I'll focus my discussions largely on COVID, in the interest of time. And as I said, early on in March, when we saw this epidemic actually going through the roof and WHO having declared this as a pandemic, we started focusing our efforts on getting some early information on the kind of tests that are available for COVID diagnostics. So today there are three kinds of tests which are available for COVID. All of us have heard about the RT-PCR or the nucleic acid-based tests, where you're basically checking for the RNA of the virus. So these tests are obviously more expensive, they're more complicated, they require more trained manpower, and can largely be done in sort of national reference labs and the intermediate reference labs. So I think that much more challenging in terms of implementing these tests. So what we started doing was that we started preparing an inventory of the various kinds of tests that are available on the market, and we started listing them on our website. And this was the information which was voluntarily received from the manufacturers. And this list splits across the nucleic acid-based tests. This also lists the information about the more rapid tests, or the rapid card test, for example, where you test for the antibody against the virus or you test for the antigen against the virus, because a lot of these tests have been used early on in China, and therefore, hence, a lot of information was available. So we listed all of these tests on our website, and we also provided information in terms of the availability of these tests, as in which of them are already commercialized, which of them are under regulatory approval, and which of them are under development. So that was the first effort that we did. What then we did was we received funding from the government of UK, where this funding was largely focused around conducting rapid evaluations of the tests which are available on the market. Now, what is happening is that a lot of countries, because of the pressures associated with increasing the testing, are very quickly according approvals to these tests. And oftentimes the countries, due to the lack of information available on the performance of these tests, are actually blind when they're making procurement decisions. So we issued an RFP as a part of which we requested the developers to submit their tests for independent evaluations by FIND. And FIND has been conducting these evaluations in collaboration with the World Health Organization and the University Hospital Geneva. As a part of this RFP, we actually got an overwhelming response to this RFP. So we had over 500 developers who reached out to us for both the nucleic acid tests as well as for the rapid diagnostic test kits. We have now started the implementation. Yeah.
Is that globally? Sorry, 500
Yes,
globally?
so that is globally. That is globally.
Okay. So
So
should
the
that,
information,
for the lay person, does that mean we have quite a good supply then for COVID test kits?
yeah, so I'll come to the supply a little bit, once I've finished answering this question. So
Sure.
as a part of these evaluations, we are rapidly conducting these evaluations, and the test results from these evaluations are being made available on our website for public dissemination. And we are also sharing this data very rapidly with WHO and other technical agencies so that the countries can make independent procurement decisions about these tests. Next, what we are also doing is that in order to ease the supply lines, as you know, the entire world is clamoring for these tests. There are a lot of requirements in the developed countries as well as in the developing countries, and there are a limited number of manufacturers. Hence, what we're trying to do is that as a part of a consortium which consists of WHO, UNICEF, UNITAID, Clinton Health Access Initiative, and the Global Fund, we are directly working with the manufacturers to understand their manufacturing capabilities. We are also working to see what kind of help they need in order to ramp up manufacturing. And also, we are on the other hand, we are collating global volumes from the various countries through these technical agencies and are trying to negotiate volume-based pricing agreements. These pricing agreements would then get listed on our website as well as on the websites of all the other technical agencies for the countries to freely access. We will also attach to that the information about the manufacturers, addresses, etc., along with the prices, so that the countries are able to access this information independently. So that's on the evaluation of tests. That's on the efforts related to increasing access to these tests, on the different kinds of tests that are today available on the market, and that is where FIND is getting involved in terms of helping the countries get easy access to COVID diagnostic tests.
It's a very, very important role for transparency, both for the availability, the source, the kind of tests, and also the cost. You outlined 3 different kinds of tests that were in various stages of development or completion for commercialization. Are they all roughly as effective as each other?
So right now, RT-PCR or the nucleic acid-based tests are considered as the gold standard of testing, whereas the antigen and antibody tests are to be used more for screening. Antibody tests can give you quick results around both the presence of past infection as well as the recent infection through the presence of the antibodies. Whereas antigen tests are again a little less, I would say, reliable than the confirmatory tests, because they will also, they would lie between the antibody-based tests and the RT-PCR tests, because they are able to give you information directly about the antigen associated with the virus. But all of these tests, I think the caveat is that you would eventually need to confirm the infection through a nucleic acid-based test. Right. So a lot depends on the sensitivity and specificity of these tests, which means that whether you are able to rule out the infections or rule in the infections. And basically, you are also able to cut down the overall costs by not subjecting everyone to a nucleic acid-based test. And then you're also able to cut down the time, because if everyone were to go for a nucleic acid-based test, there would not be enough labs or enough tests in the world to be able to turn around the test results very quickly. So that is how you need to actually have a diagnostic algorithm where the antigen and the antibody test would have a certain place. But eventually all of the infections would need to be confirmed with the nucleic acid-based tests.
Sure. So obviously testing is critical, and countries are reporting obviously the amount of corona cases that they're discovering in their countries. There has been some conjecture that India, which has managed to keep a relatively low number of coronavirus cases for the size of its population, that perhaps it's not testing widely enough. As an expert on diagnostics, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think India has a very well-rounded strategy, which consists of a very aggressive public dissemination campaign, a pretty aggressive containment strategy, wherein as early as 21st of March, the government issued orders for a countrywide lockdown restricting the movements of the citizens outside of their homes. So this, in a large part, helped in arresting any unwanted increases in the number of infections. Having said that, the initial testing was low, as far as India is concerned. But if you look at the figures now, the government has really ramped up testing, and more than 500,000 tests have been conducted. Initially, government started with almost 52 testing laboratories, all of them in the public sector. This number has now gone to over 180 labs, and they are spread across the country. In addition to that, the government has also collaborated with the private sector, and more than 80 private sector laboratories have also been identified for conducting the testing. In the private sector labs, the testing is being provided free of cost for the patients who are, for the suspects who are below the poverty line, which means that they have taken care of the affordability quotient as well. And those who can pay for the test, they obviously are paying, although the cost of testing in the private sector is still on a higher side, almost $60. But then I think the government has taken steps to ensure that those who can't, they have access to testing. Very recently, the government has also introduced the rapid test kits, and these are all antibody test kits. If you go to the ICMR website, I think they are the ones who are coordinating the efforts related to COVID in India. There is a lot of transparency in terms of the various guidelines as far as testing is concerned, the various test kits that have been approved by the government of India. The regulator in India, that's the Indian regulator, has also stepped up, and you know, the kits are being accorded rapid authorization for use in the country, so that time is not wasted once the kits have been evaluated and found satisfactory, and you know, the time required for them to be commercialized. So yes, I think it's the government is ramping up testing, and you know, and we will see that going forward. This will further increase. In fact, the Indian government has been probably amongst one of the few who has also declared that they would want to go ahead for pooled testing, which basically means that in areas of low prevalence, they would pool the samples from a family of, let's say, suspects or a group of suspects, and you know, conduct the RT-PCR on that pooled sample. And if you were to find one positive, then you can go and test each and every individual patient or the suspect in that group. But if it were negative, then you can safely rule out the infection. So that's another quick way of ruling in or ruling out infections.
Sure. No, that sounds very proactive. And what is the average cost of a testing kit for India? I'm sure it's perhaps different all across the world, but for the Indian government to procure, what's the average cost of a testing kit per person?
So there are, you know, multiple manufacturers which are available in India, and there are at least you know, a couple of them who are Indian manufacturers. So the current cost of testing for the Indian government is anywhere between $15 to $20 and per test. But I think the big thing is that, you know, all of these tests are being provided free of cost by the public sector laboratories. And as I said, the private sector has also started testing, and they're also testing those who cannot afford free of cost. But you know, private sector, obviously it comes at a cost, and the government has regulated the pricing there as well, and they have fixed a ceiling of about $62 for the private sector. So I think in addition to this, you may add some costs on account of certain other lab consumables, another $2 or $3. So I think $20 would be the ballpark at which, you know, it would be costing per test to the government of India.
Sure.
It is difficult to put an HR cost here because, you know, it varies across the public and the private sector as the compensations are different. So I think let us restrict ourselves to the absolute cost of the test at which it is being bought and the cost of the consumables that are required to run the test.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've been told also that coronavirus has not peaked in all countries. As we know, it's spread across from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere at different stages, and that we're not really all safe until the whole world is safe in a way. For how long do you anticipate we'll be needing to test for COVID, and what are the implications for supply? Do you think we'll have enough kits for the world?
So I think, this is my personal opinion, that it is not a switch on and switch off. It's not a switch on or switch off kind of a scenario, and we can't, you know, say, you know, let's say by X, Y, Z date, you know, we would be done with the COVID infections. So I think it is going to stay there. I think, you know, the good part is that, you know, more than 80 to 85% of those who are infected, you know, they will carry, you know, they will be either asymptomatic or they will be moderate infections. But I think what is the countries and a lot of countries, I would say, are taking the right decisions to sort of leverage this opportunity to stockpile for the tests, build the health system's capacity to be able to deal with not just the COVID epidemic, but with the future epidemics and outbreaks. So to that extent, I think countries should continue to keep investing in terms of building their capabilities. In terms of your specific question as far as supply lines are concerned, we are reading every day that new tests are becoming available. You know, the government of India, for example, has recently approved a whole amount of funding around the development of both vaccines as well as new diagnostic products. And we will see going forward, hopefully in the next month or so, that there should be more tests coming out of India also. But I think globally, you know, all the manufacturers, the global community of NGOs, you know, agencies like WHO, FIND, and all the others, they're all teaming up to make sure that, you know, more and more tests are being developed, they are being rapidly evaluated, the global volumes are being, you know, collated, and the pricing is being negotiated in the most transparent manner.
Sure.
You know, agencies like Global Fund, for example, they have stepped up, and they are now allowing the countries to reprogram part of their grants towards COVID. And then to that extent, even in India, for example, FIND has reprogrammed a part of this Global Fund grant to support the government of India in building infrastructure for COVID diagnostics.
And in fact, India seems to be emerging as a world leader. Obviously, it always has been for generic pharmaceuticals. But going forward, I understand it's been partnering very cooperatively with the World Health Organization in their solidarity mission to find a vaccine, and would be well placed to produce for the world, manufacturing potentially for a vaccine, certainly for diagnostic kits and for other types of necessary medtech and PPE as well. So it's really great to see India's proactivity on this. I understand India is also now in the stages, given its relatively low number of coronavirus cases per population, it's now looking at ways in which you can start safely some parts of industry. So India's been very clear that they're not opening tourism yet. However, necessary industry elements like agriculture and fisheries to ensure food security, I think was starting to open from the 20th of April. Is COVID testing a useful way to help people get back to work? And is it an affordable approach to try and test people before going back into workplaces to ensure no further spread?
Right. So I think, as you rightly said, Tanya, the government of India is taking a very balanced approach and a very cautious approach in terms of opening up the industries. You know, there are very clear guidelines which are now available on the various government websites in terms of what is going to open and what is still not allowed to open. I mean, India is a large country and we have over 1.3 billion people to feed. So it is important that we do everything to kickstart the economy as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we do not lose out on the gains which have accrued on account of, you know, the aggressive public dissemination campaign, you know, a well-graded and gradually, you know, a well-graded strategy for diagnostic testing. So yes, I think the guidelines around how these industries will be opened are currently in the process of development. And we expect that the government will be very shortly opening up these guidelines. And we do think that COVID testing is going to play a very, very important role, because the industries would also want to be sure that when they're permitting people to walk into the factories, you know, they are sure that, you know, the individuals are COVID-free and, you know, continue to stay COVID-free by practicing other, you know, safety norms like social distancing and other safety precautions, etc. So I think let's stay tuned. And we do expect that over the next few days, we will see clear guidelines from the government of India in terms of how they would expect the industries to gradually start opening.
Sure, and I do understand that you're very closely cooperating with the government and being a good source of advice, and that in fact you'll be needed very shortly. So I will let you go soon. Just one final question. The organisation, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, obviously does a lot more than just COVID testing. You're critical for diagnostic, for prevention and early detection for other major burdens of disease like neglected tropical diseases, malaria and tuberculosis. How is COVID affecting your ability to do other work? Is this preventing movement on other health burdens, or you're able to somehow find capacity to work on these other important issues as well?
So that's a good question, Tanya. So in FIND, we actually have various disease verticals, and all of these disease verticals are independently staffed and manned. So it's not that we are, drawing upon our existing resources to do whatever we are doing as far as COVID is concerned. So we have a dedicated team for AMR and outbreaks, which is right now concentrating all of its efforts on the work that we are doing in the context of COVID. But yeah, there are other teams, as far as NTDs are concerned, TB and malaria are concerned. We here in India do a lot of work in tuberculosis. So within, whatever is being permitted, given that there are, a lot of social constraints as well as other constraints in our movement, I think we are doing what best we can to ensure that things stay on track. Wherever we can offer advice to our partners, we are even, in terms of the trials of technologies that are ongoing to the best of how we can manage them. I think all of the efforts are being put in place to ensure that we do not lose out, on what we have gained. We had gained before the COVID epidemic. So long story short, so I think there's dedicated teams towards the various disease verticals that we have, and they're focusing all of their energies and efforts to ensure that we continue to work to the best of our abilities, in line with whatever constraints imposed by the COVID epidemic.
Sure. Well, often diagnostics is seen as quite a technical issue, but as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it is critical for evidence-based health policy and critical for determining government level decisions about when economy sectors can open up, when citizens can exercise basic freedoms outside. And it's just wonderful to be able to speak to someone right at the coalface of these important technical aspects, but that also provides such transparency, both in terms of evaluating the types of tests available, the providers to make sure that they're coming from safe origins, and also the transparency of costing to give the world the best chance at getting through this current challenge. So thank you very much for your time, Sanjay, and I wish you well for the rest of your very important work.
Thanks, Tanya. It's been a pleasure, as usual, and happy to be of help. So stay safe and take care.
Thank you. Likewise.